work? Oh, it's very loud. Maybe I shouldn't talk so close to the mic. And I like this pink thing. So anyway, good evening. My name is Robert Buxton. It's great to be back. I was here, I don't know, some months ago in the past. So I play classical piano and I talk about the music, but in some ways what I do is a little different because, in the old days, like 200 years ago, they used to improvise all the time. And I thought I'd start out with an improvisation, but I need your help. You can give me some random musical notes, individual notes like A, B, C, A through G, and you can sharp or flat them. We'll get about 5 or 6 notes from you. That'll be the melody, and I'll do something with it. So any notes to start? Anybody?
C.
C.
B flat.
B flat. Any more? Very unusual, and I like it. How about a couple more? Let's do that. That's a good little melody we can use. All right, that'll be the first order of business. Right? Okay. Thank you. Now, the first piece of real music, you gave me that melody, so thank you. The first real piece, though, that I'm going to play that's written now, this is an excerpt from an opera by Gluck, G-L-U-C-K. Gluck was a Viennese opera composer in the mid-18th century, a bit before Mozart. So this is from his opera Orpheus. And Orpheus, of course, it's based on the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, an ancient Greek myth in which Eurydice dies. She goes to the underworld, and Orpheus goes after her. He can't accept the loss. It's his wife. And he pleads with Hades in the underworld to let her go. By the way, he brings his harp and plays the harp to further convince Hades, who finally relents and says, you can take her with you with one condition: do not look back. And you might have heard that phrase before in the Bible. Is the same phrase, don't look back, in the Old Testament. Unfortunately, he does look back and loses her forever in the myth. But in the opera, I think I have to stand back in this one. In the opera, Eurydice actually comes back at the very end, and they have a big celebration, big party, and everyone lives happily ever after. Maybe this way, I'll experiment with it. So, this is the melody. It's a famous melody from Orpheus, and it's very mournful. It's kind of an elegy. You can feel Orpheus's emotions at the moment in the opera. And this is an arrangement by 19th century Italian composer Giovanni Scambati. So this is Gluck Scambati melody from Orpheus, originally written in like 1750 something. So. How about now? About now, sorry. Microphone. I'm not good with microphones. So that piece is beautifully sad. And I think about this a lot because, you know, this is from an opera. And there was recently a famous actor who said that nobody cares about opera. Something to that effect. It's so old, nobody cares about it. You know, here's what I think, that humans have not changed all that much in history. I mean, maybe we wear different clothes. Hopefully we are a little better in some ways than the past, but I don't think we're fundamentally different, because that piece is about the loss of a loved one. If you've ever experienced that, well, then you understand this piece. And I think that that's all there is to it, really. The next piece I'm going to play is something, you know, someone asked me if I can sing. Well, no. It sounds really good in my head, but then I open my mouth and it doesn't. I have friends who are singers and they tell me anybody can sing, you should try it. And then I try it and they say, you know what, maybe not everybody can sing. But this is a famous vocal piece, Ave Maria, by Schubert, but in Franz Liszt's solo piano version, is what I'm going to do. And Ave Maria, you've heard it probably sung in Latin to the Hail Mary prayer. That's the text. But that's actually not the text Schubert used when he wrote it. He used a German language translation of another prayer to Mary, an excerpt of Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, which is a King Arthur-themed legend poem. So it's a different context, different text, rather, that he used. Also, I want to say, Schubert, he died in 1828 at the age of 31 only. And he was plagued by bad health in his last several years, and that's when he wrote a lot of his music, especially lieder, or songs, like Ave Maria is one of those. He wrote this in his final few years. And he would, sometimes he'd write 3 or 4 lieder in a single day. He would try to write as much. I even read that he wore glasses. And he would fall asleep with his glasses on so that he could just start composing immediately when he woke up. And the last thing before he went to sleep. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. When he died, he was not only penniless, he was unknown except for a very small group of friends. But after his death, Liszt came across his music and started doing these arrangements of his lieder and playing them in his early recitals and making Schubert well known, even famous. And so we can be grateful to Liszt for doing that, for doing these arrangements and performing them, because he popularized Schubert after he died. So what Liszt does here is he turns it into a piano piece, because look, a song repeats the same music with different words. But if I were to just do that on the piano with no words, no singing, it might get dull. So Liszt creates variety by adding things. Like, I'll show you what I mean. The beginning sounds like Ave Maria as you've heard it before. It's very familiar, but then look at verse 2. All those extra notes, that ain't Schubert. That's Liszt. He added that in. And he did it because he knows that without words, you have to use other means to create variety in the piece. So here is Ave Maria by Schubert, but arranged by Liszt for piano.
you. That's my favorite piece.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That piece is powerful. Even if I can't sing it, there's something about, and Schubert, I think it's because Schubert, his life was such that I was just reading about him last night, that he had nothing. He was ill, he had no money, he was homeless, he slept on his friend's couches. That's where he would wear his eyeglasses, fall asleep in them, wake up in them, just write. He would play piano in bars to just make enough for some scraps of food here and there. It's really tragic. And you could feel it, it's something there in the music. Yeah, he's a genius. What can you say? So now I'm going to go to, another genius, Robert Schumann, who's one of my favorite composers. First I'm going to play one of his arrangements of Paganini. So I'll tell you about Paganini first before we, because Paganini was born in the late 1700s, lived into the 1800s. He was like a rock star of that time period. He was a wild man. Think of Elvis or Jimi Hendrix or somebody. He was that divisive in his time. Like, there were people who thought that he was possessed because of the way he played, and also his lifestyle. Wine, women, and song. That's an understatement. He was this wild man. But the romantic generation, who were a bit younger than him, they idolized him, because Paganini, he was living in a time when the French Revolution, the American Revolution had happened. The world was changing, and the old ways of the white powdered wigs and everything, that was all on its way out. And Paganini, here's this wild man, plays the violin like he's possessed, like he's electrocuted or electrified. And Robert Schumann heard him play in the 1830s, and he said, that's it, I have to arrange some of his music. Because the romantics like Liszt and Schumann, they wanted to be like Paganini. They saw themselves in him. So now I'll tell you about Schumann. Schumann was born in what's now East Germany in 1810. And he was fascinating because, you think of classical composers like Mozart or Mendelssohn, child prodigies, they just wrote music. You know that Schumann wanted to be a lawyer, and then he sort of flunked out of law school. So that didn't work out. Then he wanted to be a novelist. He loved literature. He was always a great writer. That didn't work out either. Then he wanted to be a pianist. And at the same time, his teacher, Frederick Wieck, he fell in love with his daughter, whose name was Clara Wieck, and the teacher forbade them to marry at first. At this time, Schumann, he was not a prodigy, so he got some kind of a contraption to strengthen his pinky finger muscles. Bad idea. He ruined his hands. So that didn't work out. And then finally, he turned his, attention to composition completely. And that's probably around the time that the marriage was not, allowed to happen or whatnot. They eventually did get married, and she was Clara Schumann. You've heard of her. But the thing is that Schumann had bipolar disorder, and they didn't really know what that was or have treatments for it back then in the early 1800s. So he suffered a great deal. A lot of these composers, like I said, Schubert earlier and now Schumann, they had tremendously difficult lives. And with Schumann, I think you can hear it in the music. Like, this is an arrangement. Yes, it's an arrangement of Paganini, but I hear more Schumann than Paganini. Let me show you what I mean. And furthermore, this is a very manic piece. Like, the original Paganini sounds like this on the violin. I don't know what that sound is, so maybe it's Paganini didn't like what I did. Here's how what Schumann does to it. It's different. It's completely different. I shouldn't talk so aggressively. It'll do that. So it's completely different what Schumann does to it. And Schumann, in his writings, came up with two characters that were, he said, the parts of himself. Florestan was the over-the-top extrovert, like this piece, the manic side. And then the depressive side, nothing I can do. The depressive side was Eusebius. So Florestan was his manic side, Eusebius was his depressive side. This Paganini study I'm going to play is the first, it's the manic side. The whole thing is manic. It's like it doesn't even breathe. Imagine somebody talking very fast without even stopping to take a breath. That's this piece. Well, if that's Schumann's manic side, I'm going to play something that's his more depressive side next. That's an early piece that he wrote, and he said that he wrote all his pieces in the early 1830s around this time in a white heat. And this was also at the time that he and Clara Wieck wanted to get married, and the father forbade it. Well, they finally got married, and I would say Schumann's music actually changed, of course, after they got married. He calmed down a little bit. And they ended up, they had like 7 kids or something. And Clara was much more well-known and famous than he was. She was a touring concert pianist. He couldn't really play with his muscles. And the way I think of it, he was kind of a stay-at-home dad a lot of the time. And he was a very good father. You don't hear that about a lot of classical composers who had kids. I don't know if Wagner had kids, but he was really not a good person. That's a whole other topic. But if he did, he was probably a lousy father. But anyway, Schumann even wrote music with the theme of childhood in his later years. Like this piece. This is called Abendlied, perfect for now, evening song. And it's from a set called Music for Children, Young and Old. Beautiful title, And this piece, it's so calm, it's even too calm. You know, it's like there's no conflict, there's no tension. It's just completely like a serene, you know, like a dream, really. And unfortunately, it was at this time that Schumann's his mental health was really deteriorating. Around the time he wrote this, he was hearing voices. And he had a suicide attempt. He tried to jump into the Rhine River in the middle of February. It was icy. And fishermen pulled him out. He survived, but he went to an asylum, which in those days, it was more like a prison, but it was a mental hospital, basically. No visitors allowed. And 2 years went by. His wife, Clara, finally snuck in to see him, spend some time with him, and then the next morning, he was gone at 46. And what I'm saying is that this is the context in which he wrote this piece. And it's very unusual because you might expect somebody going through that to write something heavy and disturbing. But this is the opposite. It's just like a dream, you know. So anyway, here it is. Evening Song, Abend Lied by Robert Schumann. Thank you. Well, now I'm going to play a piece, a longer piece, a heavier piece, a louder piece. This is Brahms' Paganini Variations. And I'll tell you about Brahms and the Schumanns, because this young boy, Brahms, before he could grow the big, giant Santa Claus beard, this young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, skinny kid, he knocked on the Schumann's door one day. They lived in Dusseldorf. Robert Schumann was out of the house. Maybe he was at Walmart or something. Well, they didn't have Walmart back then, but you know what I mean. He was doing some errands, and Clara opened the door. said, I'm a young composer, my name is Johannes Brahms, could I get some advice? And sure, come in. And he played, and Clara was stunned. And then Robert Schumann came home and met him, and he said, listen, you're amazing. Why don't you just live with us? We'll adopt you. You know, things were different in the 1850s. They didn't do background checks on people, and so the Brahms kind of lived on and off with the Schumanns. And this was at the time that Schumann's health was really, deteriorating. And actually, Brahms stepped in to help out with the family, to help Clara with the kids. I mean, she was under enormous pressure when her husband was ill, and so they became very close. And what happened was, so then Robert Schumann died, and by the way, Brahms was like 15 years younger than Clara. And so here's what happened. They went on a trip to Switzerland, after Robert died, to process the labor. And the neighbors started gossiping. And they said, this is weird. What's this young man and this older lady? They must be, dating. They must be an item. And so this persisted. I've read historians, they say that it's not true. They were just platonic friends, yada yada. Now I'm getting into People magazine territory. It's not really my business, but I also read that at some point they took the letters that they'd written to each other, many of them, and burned them. So that's a little suspicious if you ask me, but look, I didn't live in that time, I didn't know, and it doesn't matter, but this is a famous story that there was this love triangle between Brahms, Clara, a much older lady, and then Robert Schumann. They even made a movie about this in the late 1940s, and Katharine Hepburn plays the role of Clara Schumann. And I've never seen it yet. I should see it. It probably makes for good Hollywood, but I don't think it's good history. Because what I understand is Brahms, his life was pretty boring. He mainly just composed and then went to the pub and ate Wiener Schnitzel and drank beer. I don't know, because he ended up living in Vienna, But anyway, here's something funny, that this piece, the Paganini Variations, Clara Schumann, he would ask her for advice. He relied on her a lot. And she hated this piece. She called this piece Wretched Witches' Variations, which in those days was probably about as bad an insult as you could give. Normally, when she didn't like something, Brahms would destroy the piece. But for some reason, he didn't listen to her with this. What this is variations on the famous Paganini 24th Caprice, which you've heard before. It goes that. And of course, what he does with it is something else. Brahms wrote this piece. He thought he was going to write exercises for the fingers, and that's all. And then it turned into something different. They still are very tricky to play, obnoxiously tricky to play. But there are some quiet moments, not a lot, but the quiet moments are where maybe you can hear he definitely had some unrequited love, feelings for Clara, that's for sure. Let me play you some passages that I think I call them the Clara passages. For a 29-year-old to write this, it's gotta be something going on. Let me play for you, Does he hear it like? So there's this melancholy that comes out in here. Brahms is tricky because I think of him almost like a prickly pear, because he was from Hamburg. Hamburg is in the northern part of Germany. It's a very cold and rainy place, and people from Hamburg, I have some friends from Hamburg, they do not show their feelings to you much. It doesn't mean they don't have feelings. The feelings are here. It's a cultural thing. And Brahms's music can be like that, and that's the challenge, is that on the surface, some people even say that they find Brahms cold, which is not true, but if you listen deeply, there's like a volcano of emotion there. But finally, I want to say, in his later years, you've seen pictures of Brahms with the giant beard. He couldn't grow a beard until his mid-40s. So he grew the beard after all the stories I just told you. But I was driving through South Carolina recently, and I saw a guy on a Harley Davidson motorcycle at a rest area, and he was Brahms. He had the beard, and I told my wife, who's also a pianist, I said, listen, I'm going to go tell him. And I start walking, and I feel, whoosh. My wife pulled me, she said, don't you dare. He does not look like he's in a very friendly mood, and so I don't know what the reaction would have been. Hey, you, Mr. Harley Davidson, you look like a 19th century composer, but maybe he would have liked it. I don't know. Here are the Paganini variations by Brahms. I'm going to play you book 2. There's 2 books, and tonight we're going to do book 2. So. I'd like to play another piece that's based, a short excerpt of a piece that's based on that same Paganini 24th Caprice. This is from Rachmaninoff's Paganini Rhapsody of 1935. And it's you would hear the same thing in the beginning, like the theme is there. But in the 18th variation, he takes that motif and he flips it upside down to get this new melody, which is very famous. There's even movies that use it, like Somewhere in Time is a famous movie that uses that. And I think it works well for that movie because, you know, in 1935, it was almost 20 years after Rachmaninoff had left the Soviet Union, Russia, before the revolution, the communist revolution was in 1917. And he and his family, they got out, and he was, plagued with nostalgia for his homeland. Of course, he didn't want to be there, but he just missed it terribly. My mother's Russian, she's an immigrant from Russia, and I see that my parents live close by to us, and I see them often. I saw her, I had lunch at their house yesterday. I was on the way, and my mother, Russian food, Russian pictures on the wall. It's just, and that's like this piece. I mean, you can feel the heavy nostalgia there in this work. So here's the 18th variation, and it's a very different take on Paganini. You see how Paganini inspired so many people in different ways. So Rachmaninoff, 18th variation of his Paganini Rhapsody, 1935. Maybe one more classical piece, and then, well, depending on how it goes, and then some gospel. I like to close with gospel. So this is a Rachmaninoff arrangement that I just learned, and it's very tricky, and it's very fresh for me, so forgive me if something goes weird, but this is Rachmaninoff's arrangement of Rimsky-Korsakov's The Flight of the Bumblebee, which is a famous piece. And it's from an opera written in 1900. The opera is called The Tale of the Tsar Sultan. And the scene is in which a prince somehow turns into a bumblebee so he could sneak in and see the Tsar, his father. It's a Russian fairy tale, so they don't really make any sense anyways. This piece sounds so much like a darn flying insect. We have a lot of them now. That was the inspiration for me to learn this, because I started to see bumblebees in my yard. I said, okay, it's time to learn Flight of the Bumblebee. Because it's new for me, I just learned it. Sometimes the bumblebee crashes into walls, so, we'll see what happens. But, it really sounds like I was playing it for my 4-year-old. I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, 2 boys. And my 4-year-old said, hey, what does this sound like? Could you see the bumblebee? And he started itching and poor Charlie, I shouldn't have. But it just really sounds like one of those things. My wife says when I'm practicing it, she says that she starts getting really itchy and feels like there's something flying around in your face. I'd like to play a couple gospel improvisations. I play gospel, and maybe this is getting to be like an old, worn-out joke that I tell, but it's true. Both of my parents are immigrants. I told you my mother immigrated from the Soviet Union, from Russia. My dad is also an immigrant from a place known as Southern Virginia, and that country, and he raised me on gospel, old-time gospel. He was always telling me when I was growing up, all right, when are you going to learn some real music? So, well, here's some real music. I'm going to play Where Could I Go But to the Lord with some improvisation added to it. Thanks. To close, I want to play a very upbeat country gospel song. Turn your radio on. You know that's it's a very old. They don't sing it in churches anymore so much. Albert E. Brumley wrote it. He also wrote "I'll Fly Away" and many others. So here it is. You know the song "If We Never Meet Again." That's by Albert E. Brumley, too. Amazing gospel music composer. So here's "Turn Your Radio On." Thank you. Well, thank you. I think we can wrap up there. Have a wonderful evening, great weekend, and thank you all very much for coming, for having me. So, thank you. If you liked it, please ask to have me back. I'd love to come back soon. So, thanks. Take care.